Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and today we're taking a look at a Jubilee video that featured Alex O'Connor that is just blowing up in the theology and apologetics realm. And one of the people that was in the video talking with Alex O'Connor was my friend Tim Howard, and we've got him here today to talk about his appearance. Tim, welcome to the show. How's everything going, man?
Oh man, want to say thank you so much for having me on. I'm extremely grateful. Dude, everything's going great. The Jubilee video dropped. I love seeing everyone's different takes and opinions on this. Tons of reaction videos to this video. So I'm excited to kind of see exactly how we're going to kind of take this apart.
Yeah. So if you're watching, we're glad to have you here. Hope you'll check out Tim's channel. It's linked in the description. All of his social stuff is linked in the description. So we'll hope you'll check that out. And so let's just jump right into this and get going. What do you think, Tim?
For sure. Let's get into it.
All right, let's do it.
Good work. Alex, my man.
How's it going? Nice to meet you too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous or whatever
in particular, non-human animal suffering? Because
Okay, let's stop right here, Tim, just for a minute, because I want to ask you a couple of things. First of all, these Jubilee videos, if people haven't seen it, it's kind of wild that everyone kind of dashes for the chair. And we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, but what is that like when you're sitting there and you know, like, man, I think I'm the guy to answer this question, not in an arrogant way, but I think I'm the guy. Like, what is that all like? How does that, are you like on the edge of your seat? Have you got your running shoes on? Tell us about that.
Oh my gosh. Well, first, it really starts with you're making eye contact with someone in the room because someone has the same thought, is in the same predicament as you, which is, this is my question. There were so many individuals you could see in their eyes and their faces that they were like, no, this is my question. I'm going to get to that chair. And then others are like sitting back, looking around going, who's going to take this question? I don't know if I can take this question. And this suffering bit, people weren't really jumping at the bit on this one too much. Some of the other topics, right? Jesus never claimed to be God. Oh, everyone was like, how dare you, say that. And so that was one where it was like, I'm just going to sit in my chair. What was interesting about me is I was directly positioned behind Alex. So if you like in the video, I have to like reach my hand and grip the chair from like underneath to like grab it,
Yeah, you're like in the worst possible position to try to get in that chair.
It's so funny because the screenshot Alex posted where our boy Than Christopoulos, he's running and it looks like he slaps me in the face, while I'm trying to get the chair, and I'm like ducking because him and I are running, and I'm tall. I'm 6'2". Than's
wow.
shorter than I. Than's, all beefed up. And so we're just like, it's unstoppable force meets a movable object type of situation. So it was good to grab that. And I remember him and I, when I grabbed the chair, he looked at me. He was like, I'll let you get that one. Like,
Yeah.
go sit back down.
Well, and I want people to know that you and Than are two guys that I know. And as a guy that works at a seminary myself and everything, there are people there that maybe they're content creators or something, some of the other Christians. And, they're it's not that they don't give good answers. I don't know. I haven't really watched all of them, but I can definitely vouch for you and Than as people that I think people should listen to. And so if Tim's stuff and Than's stuff seems a little more complex or out there or takes more time to explain, well, that's because they're kind of doing this more the right way than maybe some sort of short answers that others might give. And I wanted to kind of say, we're starting here talking about the problem of suffering, which suffering is a problem. The question is, how do you react to that? And when an atheist brings an argument against theism, the belief that there is a God, we call that an argument from evil. And specifically what Alex is doing here, the atheist, is he's limiting that to suffering that animals experience. And I think this poses a particular challenge. And for many people, this is a much more challenging question to answer, because in the case of humans, you can think, well, maybe the person experiences some period of suffering and they learn from that, and there's something transformative, there's some character building and those sorts of things. Maybe they're being made right for the next life. These are maybe there's something with free will to do with this. These are all answers that people have given in the history of philosophy and in the history of Christian thought. But with an animal, it's a little different, because you can't have a conversation with an animal like we're having right now and ask him how he's feeling after having gone through, that horrible, attack from the lion or whatever. So it's a little bit more challenging. Do you agree with that? What do you think about the animal suffering? Why is this something that you found so interesting to study it and wanted to get in that chair?
Yeah, what's really funny is I had so many of the Christians who participated on Jubilee actually afterwards come ask me and go, "Why is Alex so obsessed with these animals?" It was really, really funny. Even the people that voted me off, and they were like, "Hey, you had a really good, thing going there." I'm like, "Why'd you vote me off?" But like sincerely, I had people ask me like, "What's this whole thing about the animals?" And I love the question. Some people don't really perceive the force of what he's trying to do. So the best way I can explain it is, if you're familiar with theodicy, put simply, theodicy is just an explanation of evil.
Mhm.
What is the reason that God didn't prevent some such suffering? That's usually the form in which it's put in this kind of non-prevention kind of sense.
Mhm.
And some people like to put forth what's called a soul building theodicy. As you know, it's this idea that, hey, suffering, it can beget growth, right? To become a compassionate person, full of generosity, full of love, of the kind of the highest order. You don't just do that in your comfortable little vacuum. You have to be put in situations where to have compassion, a logical precondition is there has to be something worth being sad over. To be full of forgiveness, as Jesus actually calls us to be, there has to be wrongdoing in this world.
Mhm.
So the idea of the soul building theodicy is that God creates an environment where the conditions are such that it makes it likely that there's going to be hardships, but these hardships aren't prevented because they end up making us better in these moral ways. That's more so the idea there. However, the problem with that is that requires a certain level of cognition. Morality is what I call a rational enterprise. To be a moral agent requires that you can reason about moral concepts. And unfortunately, animals just don't have that part of the consciousness that we do. We know that chimps have a limbic system. They have, brain regions and brain anatomy similar to us. But if you were to ask them a true or false question, uh, it doesn't register, right? And that's a precondition for being able to reason about things like, you know, um, moral dilemmas, right? A chimp is not going to be able to answer the trolley problem. You know what I'm saying? Do
Yeah.
I pull the lever on the fat guy or not? If anybody's familiar with taking a philosophy class, you always go through these trolley problems. So the problem is that animals can't soul build. They can't,
Mhm.
hindsight, look back at their suffering and go, "Oh, that was the reason why." We've all gone
Mhm.
through hard things, right? I've gone through plenty of hard things where I wouldn't go through it again. Like I wouldn't wish to go through it again, but I recognize how it shaped me, and I positively support how it shaped me. And animals, they kind of just go through it,
Mhm.
and they're just
Mhm.
kind of left to it. And I think the biggest problems that we observe animals who don't just go through the suffering where they can't soul build. Some animals die in agonizing pain and death by being ravaged by other animals. Sometimes starving for weeks or for days before they die. Um, and if they can't even soul build, then well, I guess it's like, what is God doing?
So
It's
it
it's
kind of
very
limits
hard.
the number of answers that we have, the tools in our tool belt to
Yep.
deal with the arguments from evil. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, it's like, okay, we can use the soul building and free will for humans, but it doesn't look like we can use that for animals. So,
Yeah. All right. Well, let's keep trucking and see what else Alex throws in front of you.
Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists.
Yeah.
Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff. none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals,
Great.
and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking
Now, real quick, Tim, are you just saying here basically that we have to think more about what our values are? What are the assumptions about morality that we bring into the discussion? Is that really what we're saying here? Kind of explain this to me like I'm 5.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea about assuming a value system before a problem is ever generated is this idea that whenever we recognize or motivated to do something, an action worth doing, it's because we recognize that there's something valuable about something. Either if you're eating, like, let's say you love ice cream, right? The taste of chocolate ice
I
cream.
do.
Well, it's the pleasure. Awesome. Yeah. So it's the pleasure of the ice cream that drives you and motivates you to actually consume it. The idea here is that we're assuming something about God's desires based on the value of suffering. In this assumption, suffering lacks so much value that it doesn't seem like God would desire it, because it doesn't seem like there's anything to be had in a world with suffering versus a world without suffering. So what the atheist has to do for the problem of evil to get off the ground is they have to make an assumption about what God values.
Yeah,
And
this
yeah, go ahead.
seems kind of like when we're talking about with human beings, God might value, say, courage or self-sacrifice,
Mhm.
and if you don't have some level of suffering or the potential for suffering in the world, then you don't get some of those goods that you would otherwise get if you had some suffering. So the suffering becomes an important part of getting at some of those goods like courage. So the difficulty, obviously, though, is when we go to animals, they don't really have that sort of an understanding about those things. As you said a moment ago, they're not necessarily developing courage, at least not in the same way we are. So how does this trace when we're talking about animals?
Exactly. And the one thing I wanted to make apparent in that part of the conversation was the problem of evil doesn't even get off the ground unless you are showing that my worldview is assuming something about God, what God values, that doesn't actually line up with the way the world is. And that's one
Mhm.
thing I wanted to show him, which is like, you're saying that it's unlikely that if God exists in the theistic worldview, this would be the case. But this is what we call the internal critique. And an internal critique is simply where you form an argument against someone's position. You don't hold their position, but you try to show that there's like that person believes maybe two things that actually don't mesh well together. And what I wanted to show him is I said, well, you have to show that I actually do believe two things that don't go together. Like if I were to tell you right now, Braxton, that I'm a vegan, and then you see me like pull up a ribeye steak and start eating it, you would say, no, you're not. Because the very definition of being vegan negates that I eat meat, or else I'm not a
Mhm.
vegan. And this is not even no true Scotsman. That's just what it means.
Mhm.
So you're not a vegan yourself, but you're showing you're like, hey, I at least understand what it means to be vegan, and you aren't doing what it means to be vegan. And in the same way, Alex is saying, well, God doesn't desire the suffering, so he would prevent it. And I'm saying that might be an assumption that you have, but you haven't shown that that's an assumption that I have. And so I
Right.
don't know if I even have a problem yet. And that's the first part I wanted to lay, which
Yeah,
is,
you're saying
which
he's
yeah,
bringing an external critique from his perspective rather than the internal, and he's breaking the internal critique when he makes
Mhm.
assumptions about what this God that he doesn't believe in would do.
It'd be like someone coming to a game of chess and complaining that the mechanics of chess aren't checkers.
Okay, all right, let's try a little bit more.
Non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection, such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything it goes.
Okay, let's stop right there, because you actually mentioned to me that even though we saw Than in the background nodding vigorously, he agrees with what you're saying. You've had some pushback from Christians because it sounds like you're saying something, I don't know, that is completely out of step with the Christian narrative to some people when you say that God doesn't create worlds. So do you want to define that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. Yeah. So just disclaimer. This is a portion of the discussion that I wish I would have phrased differently. And so I will totally put that on the table. Like, if you're someone that thinks that what I said kind of sounds asinine for a Christian to say, I totally understand where you're coming from. So allow me to dispel that. So what people are probably hearing me say is that God didn't create the world in terms of like the universe, right? And that is 100% as far from what I'm actually trying to say. Rather, what I'm talking about is I'm critiquing what I think Alex is assuming, which is a particular model of how God creates. And I'm trying to separate myself from that model. Because notice what he says. He says that, well, God sets up the system, meaning that if you believe that prior to creation, God is looking out into the annals of time, it sounds like what Alex is saying is that God sees that it's possible for animals to suffer, it's not possible for animals to suffer, and then like he selects the specific possibility and says, at this point in the universe's history, I'm going to ensure that these animals suffer over here, and just kind of like reaches into the depths of time and places it, and then lets the world rip. And I'm saying, no, I don't think that God exhaustively selects every single portion of the universe and how it develops, right, in that particular way. So that would obviously make me not a determinist about that. Rather, I think that, and this model is actually what's called, use kind of a convoluted word here, it's called the disjunctive model of creation, rather than the conjunctive, conjoining things together. The idea here is that I believe that God sets up the terms and conditions, like the parameters for how creation will develop and where it's going. And God governs that, but he's not like tinkering and pushing things along, specifically selecting where they're supposed to go. I think that then God actually imbues this ingredient of chance into the universe, so that the universe actually ends up being like this co-participant in bringing about God's plans. And if you're a Christian and you're listening to me say this, and you might be wondering, well, why would God use chance? You should actually be very comfortable with God using mediators to fulfill his plans. I mean, you have to believe that about Jesus Christ. What does the scripture say, right? It predicted that Christ would come through the line of David. What does an omnipotent God need a biological lineage for to bring about something, right? But rather God chose to. So God in the Old Testament and New Testament, we always see God gladly working through mediators. He works through people. So I'm saying, hey, what if he does that on the whole with the entire universe? So that's more so what I'm saying.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying when you're saying your model doesn't include this determinism that some Christians might hold to, and certainly many non-Christians, the notion that the universe is like unto a billion or trillions of chains of dominoes that result in all the things that happen in the past history of the universe, as well as your past life experiences, the formation of your neural structure, the firings of neurons in your brain, that result in your choices. It's not as though all of that is just set. It's more a universe that God creates that is interactive in a sense, in that there is some indeterminacy in it. There is some libertarian freedom, some real free choices in there. And God may be ultimately setting the boundaries, like you say, but he works within that. Am I phrasing that in a way that makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly the idea that I have.
Okay, great. All right. So anything else you want to say on that before we jump back into the video?
No, that's everything sounds good. Yeah.
So everyone needs to know Tim is not a heretic saying that God is not a creator.
Exactly.
He's
Well, this actually
just,
is one thing that I want to add.
yeah.
That's okay right here, which is I actually had someone also think that my explanation there, the one that I just gave, also kind of sounds like deism, right? And the one thing I
Mm,
want to do is distance myself from deism as well. I want to make apparent the way in which at least philosophers um understand deism is that you can take, like, let's take God's three attributes, right? Moral perfection, having all power, having all knowledge. Uh, what deism would say is that that part of God's moral perfection, we don't believe in that because that would make God interested in our lives. And so to be a deist, you have to believe that God is uninterested in the moral affairs of his creatures. Rather, my model says that God is interested in our moral affairs and governs them while the universe is playing out. So I want to make sure that I also don't, I also want to distance myself from the charge of deism as well.
Yeah, and I don't think it would make sense to call that deist unless someone is really being hyperbolic or something. Because the fact is, it's not as though God set the universe spinning and then just kind of walked away. He's very active, as you mentioned before, in the history of the world, and particularly the history of mankind. You know, he steps in, he interacts, he become. You know, we have God incarnate in the Lord Jesus Christ, so he's very active in and with the world. You're just saying not to the degree that it's deterministic, right? That's really what we want to drive out.
100%. Well put. Well put.
All right. Well, let's keep trucking then.
Sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay,
but
so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, hold on, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
Okay,
Okay, let's stop right there for just a second. So, so this is really interesting. So you're saying basically that okay, it looks like some really horrific thing happened to the dog. The dog gets hit by a car, or let's not go there. The dog develops some illness because of whatever, and it experiences a lot of suffering, and then it goes on to live its life. Let's say we would have to take into account the entirety of the existence of the dog, not just its life here on earth and the suffering, but everything that's true about its existence. And then ask the question, did it, now this is a good question here. This is where we could dig in. On the one hand, you could ask the question, is the dog in some sense satisfied or think it was worth it and is glad to have existed?
No, all good. So this is actually where Alex plays a little bit of a philosophical sleight of hand. And I'll show this. I made a video recently on this, and a lot of people have actually been benefiting from this analogy. But I call it the motivation versus justification conflation, where he's conflating these two terms and these two ideas. The problem of evil can actually be split up into kind of actually two stages of presenting the argument. The first is the justification stage, which is when we talk about moral justification. What exactly do we even mean by that? I think it's a good place to start. Well, first, what we mean by that is why is God not bad for not preventing suffering? So, why is God not bad for his choice of non-prevention? And the answer to that question is going to result in God being morally justified. So what atheist philosophers have done who pioneer these arguments from evil is they say, well, because of God's, morally perfect nature, God's not going to do anything that's unjustified. So if you are unable to answer that question, and there's no model we can kind of conceive of to make that make sense, it seems like we can just plausibly conclude God is unjustified, and that's not something that would be a part of God's character or nature. So we can conclude that God doesn't exist, something like that. And what I'm saying is, okay, well, that justification is actually very different than God's psychology, his motivation for creating a world with it where there's an environment that ends up producing suffering. And the reason why that's different is imagine one day you see me making coffee, right? And then you ask me, Braxton, Tim, why are you morally justified in making coffee? Well, that's a very strange question, because usually you would ask, why are you making coffee? That's a psychological question. In terms of my psychology, it might be because I like the taste of coffee. I like the utility of caffeine. I need to wake up in the morning. This is a habit I have, et cetera, and so forth. That would be in terms of like my preferences, desires, and intentions. The justification question, you're simply asking, Tim, are you doing anything unethical by drinking coffee? That's what the justification has concerned. Now, notice this. If you answer the question of justification, you actually don't need to even settle the motivation part, because the problem arises from God not having moral justification. So I can say, hey, it can be completely mysterious to me as to why God intended for there to be a world that eventually has suffering. But if God's not bad for not preventing that suffering, then where is the problem? There isn't one. So, I mean, it's interesting. We could talk about God's psychology. I mean, it's interesting. But really, the rub has to do with the justification. And what Alex does is he actually conflates that they're the same thing when they're not. The language there that shows that he's doing that is he'll say, well, why did God allow? And then he would say, well, why did God create? Though that's the conflation that's happening. It's a little bit of a sleight of hand. And so the question becomes, well, is there like an ethical framework that we can like identify that would actually show us why God's not bad and not preventing the suffering? And the one that I'm actually giving is one in terms of redemption. Well, if God knows that this can ultimately be redeemed, where the creature for themselves actually knows, where the creature for themselves actually like doesn't regret their existence or the evil experience that happened to them, and they come to psychologically actually consent and endorse to the life that they lived, then we consider that suffering to no longer have an impact on their life and now been defeated. If we can triumph and suffering has no longer impact from your life, then it's hard for me to see where a problem is, because ultimately the problem that we should have is if there's irredeemed suffering. If God is redeemer, right, as we Christians believe, irredeemable suffering is not on the table. So then what I'm basically saying is, well, then what if there's a situation where the suffering is redeemed, right? Then we have a reason to believe that God isn't bad for not preventing that suffering.
Okay, now that raises a couple of questions that I'm just thinking of right now as we're talking. So I get the notion that let's start with humans, because we're going to move to animals in just a second.
Sure.
But with humans, let's say I get to a point where I've had a lot of suffering in life, but also a lot of good things. And ultimately in the afterlife, I agree, hey, my existence has been, worth it. Like I am pleased with my existence, everything considered, even in spite of some pretty horrendous suffering, let's say. Okay, that's the thing you're saying then renders the suffering that has happened not really a problem anymore. Have I got this right so far?
Yeah, one little tweak there, which is
Yeah.
the suffering that happened to them, it doesn't become good. I've seen people also take this interpretation for what I'm saying is they hear me saying, oh, so then it was good that they suffered. No, not exactly. The suffering still remains bad, but rather it actually gets reintegrated into their overall life story in a different way.
Yeah, you like you say, redeemed. Like we could say a woman is SA'd, someone does something bad to a woman, and let's say she becomes pregnant, and then God can bring something beautiful out of the life that is born. Maybe that person becomes a preacher and leads many, many people to faith in Christ. Well, we might think as Christians that was an incredibly valuable redemption of a horribly evil act, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the act itself was still very bad, right? Is that kind of where we're going?
Oh, a lovely example. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, that leads me to the question then. You keep kind of mentioning the sort of, I don't want to say consent, but the acknowledgement of the individual that, okay, hey, I can see this now was, this all worked out or whatever. And I'm happy to exist because of this. I feel like God is morally justified in my existence. Now, the question becomes, can a person not recognize that and it still be true that it was morally justified? Or is the acknowledgement of it, the acceptance of it by the individual, a requirement for it to have been morally justified?
Absolutely. So this is what I call, there's two interpretations about this one. One is about what I call just mere opportunity versus equity. Meaning, if all suffering has the intrinsic, the inherent opportunity by any creature that suffers to be defeated and redeemed, there's that interpretation. And then there's the one about equity, which is all creatures must actually seize the opportunity to defeat their suffering, right? And so the idea here is it really depends on where you land on those two interpretations there. But what's minimally required, I would say, is the opportunity. Does the suffering have the inbuilt potential to be redeemed? Because again, if God creates a world and knows that eventually there will be intrinsically irredeemable suffering, like not even God can help this person, that would be really weird, right? Like not even God can help you recover, nor you can recover yourself. That doesn't there doesn't seem to be any point in that. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So that would actually constitute a case of pointless suffering. So I think that what's minimally required is, does the suffering have the opportunity to be defeated in that person's life? Right.
Gotcha.
Because if they're never cut off from it, then they're never without the resources or the help or the guidance to have that reality actually come through fruition there.
Yeah. And I'm really excited for people to hear and for me to understand better how we now move that whole system or that way of thinking about this from the conversation you and I have just been now having about human beings over to my dog, Indy, and how this could all work out for him. So
Sure.
I guess we could hear what Alex has to say, and then we can talk about that more. Or do you think now we should talk about it?
Let's play the clip because it's actually going to segue us really well into that. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Okay, because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if
No, I want you
you
to
had an
pause
author
it
writing a
here.
book and a character, if we were trying to figure out
Yeah.
Notice what Alex just did there. I don't think he intentionally, like in a malicious way, intended for that. Notice how I said antemortem, and postmortem, meaning the redemption of their suffering is going to include both phases of their life.
Yeah.
He then said, well, if we just talk about Earth,
Yeah.
I wish I would have caught that, Braxton, on set, because I didn't see that. But
Because
playing it back,
it seems like what he's saying is, I know that you just gave a much broader range for your side of this, but I'm going to, even though I just asked that question, restrict it back down to where I can deal with it. Is that what it seems like?
exactly. He can, because he's like, here's a version that I can actually critique, and I'm actually comfortable in critiquing, that doesn't include that afterlife portion. And so what he's going to do now, he's going to begin to critique what I'm saying based off of only the earthly life. So what he's going to say is, okay, well, deer gets trapped in forest fire, dies. Where's the redemption? When I literally just said 2 seconds ago that the redemption involves not just the earthly life, but also the afterlife. I didn't catch that, but I don't think that was intentional on his part. But what it shows is the weakness of his argument, that it has to leave out the afterlife portion to succeed.
Now, before we move on with this, I think it could be helpful to Christians, the same sorts of Christians that thought you were saying God didn't create the world. They may wonder, like, well, why should we believe that there's some afterlife for animals? I don't see necessarily any decisive biblical reason to think that as a Christian. I don't see any reason to think that on other evidence outside of my Christianity. Explain what we're doing here and why this move is okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I want to say is this is a very valid question. Ultimately, we are talking about something that we have yet to observe.
Mhm.
Here's the beauty about this, though. I believe that we actually have a logic for reasoning about things that are unobservable. Specifically, we do that with God all the time. We seem to think that there is reason to believe that God exists, even though we've never seen him. We seem to believe that there are actions that we can ascribe of God, even though we've never seen God actually directly perform those actions. We think about things we haven't observed, and we reason about things we haven't observed all the time. And how we do that is we start with things that we feel are clear to us that we already know, right? And then what we do is we extrapolate based on things that we already know. For example, one that scientists do is the second law of thermodynamics. They talk about how there's going to be a state of the universe where it's just going to be desolate. The sun is going to run out of energy. It's going to incinerate the earth and everything. Um, but they haven't observed that. What they're merely doing is they're taking the properties and what we know of thermodynamics, and they're saying, okay, if we were to extrapolate what we understand about thermodynamics into the future, what do we think could happen? Scientists don't know with 100% certainty that that's how things are going to play out. But they think based on our best models, this is the future of the universe.
Mhm.
What I'm saying is, okay, well, what if we do the same thing, but with like what we know about God's love? Meaning, we
Mm.
may not have direct, explicit biblical support in the sense that the Bible truly states, "Oh, all animals." Like you read in there, all animals will be redeemed, and they'll be in earth, and they'll be happy, and your dog will be in there, right? We need to understand that, but just in the same way that you can almost predict a certain kind of behavior from someone you know who has a certain character. Like if you have a friend named Jim and you know that Jim, all your life that you've known him, he's been a generous person. You can predict that Jim is going to have situations in his life that he's going to be generous in, right? In the same way, if we believe um, that the revealed nature and character of God is in Jesus Christ, and that Jesus displayed what we call agape love, which is this unconditional self-giving love that desires the good of the other person for their own sake, then if God also created the animals, he also then presumably has an interest in their well-being as well. I mean, we know that animals experience pain and experience suffering, like we've already talked about. Then I can say, well, if God is a God of agape love, then I think that he presumably has a purpose for them too. I don't think that they're
Yeah.
just background characters, as like we like to treat them sometimes, as just background creatures. And so I think that what I'm doing is I'm extrapolating based on what I understand about the revealed nature of God and what he might do in the future. Am I saying that I know for certainty that animals will be in heaven, all these different things like that? No, not at all. Do I have arguments that I can give for that, like I do have for other things? Yes, I do. And I think that even if you're, on the fence about this, listen, I didn't come to this conclusion myself overnight. Um, and you might find yourself going, wow, I never thought I would believe that there would be like an animal afterlife or something like that. But it's been through years of critical reflection that, I think that we can kind of use our reason and some things that we know about God to come to this kind of understanding. So I hope that makes sense.
It does, and if someone says, "Well, I just can't go there," I think what you could still see is, okay, we just heard from Tim at least some evidence that this is true. Maybe it's not decisive, but some evidence. I think there is some biblical evidence. There's going to be the redemption of all things, that sort of thing. That there could be some evidence from within and without maybe it's not decisive, but what it does mean is that if an atheist were to claim, and I don't think that Alex has gone so far as to say this, but if Alex or some atheist were to say that animal suffering demonstrates that God does not exist, well, we could say, hold on a second, there's a defeater to that claim. And the defeater to that claim is it is at least possible. And we have some evidence to believe that there's going to be an afterlife experience where justice will be doled out in a positive way for these animals. And so as long as that is at least a possibility, then it undercuts the notion that you have therefore demonstrated that such a God can't exist. So I can see that one could study this for years like you and maybe read resources on it and come to the conclusion that my dog Indy is going to get to go to heaven one day. But even if you're not ready to go there, you can say, well, as long as that's a possibility, it means that the claim that this God can't exist doesn't go through.
Oh, beautifully put. Yes, I endorse that claim as well. Absolutely, because then that would at least blunt the force, at least neutralize the force of the argument, where now at least the atheist can't at least use that anymore as a reason to not believe in God.
Right. All right, so let's keep trucking.
Antemortem, postmortem.
Okay, because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I ask, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly.
Right.
So they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion.
Sure.
How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can
Do
talk.
you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that
Yeah,
suffering.
but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why you say? What's the term of necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize justified,
tell me
unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Okay, before we go on, is there anything here that you want to touch on?
Yeah, again, Alex, I gave him a softball there when I said, what is the term necessity doing here? I asked that not because I didn't know what he was saying. I asked that because I precisely did know what he was saying, and I wanted him to say it so we could move the conversation forward. He had a very rhetorically powerful speech there, and I wanted to basically streamline how am I going to go to the next part of the conversation that's going to attack the heart of what he's saying, because he completely ignored my post-mortem reply. So when he says necessary, I'm like, yes. So if you read famous William Rowe, he is the famous atheist philosopher that pioneered the evidential argument from evil, specifically having to do with gratuitous suffering. And
yeah, he's got the famous paper, The Evidential Argument from Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, that everyone should read. It only take it 3 or 4 pages,
Yep. I think it's necessary reading, absolutely. Where he precisely defines in analytic fashion what it means for God to actually be justified in allowing suffering, and he coins what we can call the necessity condition. God can only authorize suffering or allow suffering if it's necessary. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, it means 2 things. Necessary to bring about a greater good, or necessary to prevent a greater evil. So, for example, if I go through something really hard in my life, but it ends up producing something even greater, like a greater positive on the other side, he would say, okay, well, God doesn't have to prevent that because it brought about this greater good. And it seemed like it was necessary. Another way you can think about that is, did the good outweigh the bad? And some atheist philosophers have actually articulated greater goods and lesser goods in terms of goods outweighing bad. So did the positive outweigh the negative? If the positive outweighed the negative, then it's considered, justified. Then there's to prevent a greater evil. What he's saying is, hey, sometimes, the only way to prevent, an even greater evil is to just allow this minor evil to happen, right? So that could be a reason why suffering exists. So if you go out into the world and you see some evil, you go, well, if God is governing this world, that evil might just exist because if it didn't, we'd be in a really bad spot. Or that evil might just exist because, hey, later down the line, it's going to end up producing something even better than what's happening right now. But Rose says, outside of that, it's completely pointless. There is no purpose. Suffering. Exactly. It is purposeless. It is pointless. There is no reason. And that's and so I gave Alex a softball. I said, hey, Alex, is this what you mean? And what's funny is he didn't even take that interpretation. He just said, well, I mean, unjustified. And I'm looking around and I'm going, Braxton, I said, what theist would believe that God is unjustified in anything that he's doing? Right. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, so why would I believe that? So I'm like, okay, well, in that moment, I was like, I find it funny that Alex didn't just agree with me. Yeah. I gave him the system and the setup there.
Right.
So what I'm doing at this point in the conversation, I'm saying, well, what if we had a different set of what I call justifying norms? A norm is simply like a guideline. Think about like rules that we live by, right? It's polite to open the door for somebody when they're, walking in. That could be a norm. That could be a guideline, some values you live by. I'm saying, well, what if the values that God lives by isn't one where all this stuff has to be necessary? But what if he knows that, hey, this is going to be redeemable in the end. And that's why I don't prevent it, right? Because there's no need to prevent it because nothing will be lost. Think about it that way. I am not losing out on anything if I allow this to happen because it's intrinsically redeemable. And so I said to Alex, I said, well, what kind of God would allow this would be one that knows it's not intrinsically irredeemable. And so, yeah.
Now, this is really interesting because well, tell me if I'm wrong here. This seems like another avenue of addressing this than the standard skeptical theism approach, where we're trying to say something like, hey, we may not know how God's going to work this out for some greater good, but we can imagine that he will, and using that as a defeater, kind of like I was mentioning defeaters a moment ago. This is a different way of going, saying, hey, regardless of what you think about the greater goods that might come about in life, the truth is this can be redeemed. And I guess in some sense that would be a great good that could come out of this.
Right. Yeah. And that's another question, which is someone might ask, and Alex asked, like, well, why does God have to go through all the trouble, quote unquote, the trouble of having to redeem all this when he could just like never have that happen? But I find that really peculiar because if we're familiar with the concept in art called a mosaic, right? Where you could take a pane of glass and smash it into uncountable pieces. You could actually build those pieces up into something that is so uniquely valuable that if it wasn't built up out of the shattered pieces of glass, the value that art piece has would not exist. And I'm saying, well, what if there was a worship song actually that I heard, and I remember really latching on this one lyric. It said, "We're being painted in mercy's hue," and I went, "Yes." What if the kinds of creatures that God is getting are the kinds of creatures that have the way in which we're being painted, are the very value we have has to do with like the struggle and like the ugly pieces. And what if God is fashioning the ugly pieces into this beautiful artwork where we're actually all beautiful art pieces, where on the whole, we are actually these beautiful works of art? What if that is why God is interested in redemption rather than just, creating us in this hedonistic paradise?
That's beautiful, man. I love that. That's so great. All right. Well, I kind of want to dig into that further, but I know that Alex is going to press you on that in a few minutes in the video. And so we'll circle back to it.
Sure.
But I guess I should say where I see us right now in the discussion, in this brief discussion, is that you have laid out your understanding of how this might work. and ultimately you're saying, hey, it could be that in the end, all things considered in a being's life, that being may see and recognize and acknowledge that this was good because God had morally justified reasons for doing this, all things considered. And that may come in the afterlife. And Alex wanted to restrict that to life here on earth. But where we're going in my mind is, okay, but how does an animal in the afterlife have the cognition? I mean, you know, it's kind of like the old saying, if a lion could talk, you still couldn't have a conversation with it because its frames of reference are so bizarre to you, you know? And so how could this dog, my dog, Indy, have a recognition in the afterlife? But let's play a little more of the video and get into that discussion right now.
It's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, with redeemability, or we call it defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. You're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer a bunch.
It's not means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000. Yeah. But why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out by the majority.
Awesome,
Please
man.
return to your seat.
Good stuff.
Okay. If people aren't familiar, that's the nature of the show. When I guess it's 10 people. Is that what it is? When 10 people raise their flag?
Yeah, we had our threshold at that point was 14.
Okay. So when 14 people raise their flag, you're out and somebody else gets to go up. So, okay, I did kind of set that up perfectly because now we're at this point where we're talking about how can this animal recognize any good? And you said something like, and I'm thinking about my dog, Indy. So when I tell Indy, good boy, or I toss him a treat and tell him good boy, it sometimes is, at least it seems quite obvious with the dog that he's happy that I was pleased with him and he's happy with his life and he's happy about the treat. And it seems like you're saying maybe in a more robust way, but a similar way, this is how they could acknowledge that their life was worth living. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Right before we get into that part, I want to say that Alex interrupted me at a very convenient point, at least for him, because he said, well, hold on. He's like, this is the one where the deer dies. And I looked at him like, dude, I was so confused in my head. I'm like, did he not hear me when I mentioned the afterlife part?
Yeah, but he restricted it. He restricted the whole discussion to this life.
And I'm just like, okay. So I had to say, Joe, you're probably talking about the post-mortem bit, something in my head. Okay, well, now we got to shift into that. And I said, okay. And then he said, but like, what for? And I said in my head, I said, nothing about what I've said is a means justifies the ends thinking. That's consequentialism, where the consequences determine the rightness of the action, which is not at all. You can't even derive that from what I'm saying. So he said, when he's saying what for, he's still thinking in that necessity terms. This must be necessary for this. And I'm saying not at all. And I'll even gladly agree with people that, because people will say, oh, this is philosopher Graham Oppy's logical problem of evil, that the heavenly goods argument, which is, well, if we'll be happy in heaven, then it doesn't, and there's going to be no suffering, then why do we need to be happy now because of suffering? And I can completely agree with Graham Oppy. Yeah, we can, we don't need suffering to be happy. God could have created us with some kind of internal constitution that just gives us pleasure chemicals all day long. Sure, that's fine. So I don't need these things to be necessary. There is this concept, though, of not being able, where two things are actually unable to be measured against one another or compared to one another. Philosophers use the term, it's called incommensurate, when something is incommensurate with one another. Another way of saying, we always say it, when we say it's an apples to oranges comparison, we're saying, listen, the way that an apple is, you can't treat it like an orange. And the way that an orange is, you can't treat it like an apple. And what I'm saying, Alex, is like, even if it's not necessary, is it still worthwhile? That becomes the question. Is it still worthwhile? Let's take two individuals who are Olympic swimmers. But let's say that their backstories are one Olympic swimmer grew up in a rich family and had the best trainers his entire life. And he makes it to the Olympics. And he's up on the center stage and he's competing. And let's say that you have this Olympic swimmer who came from a third world country, who was poor and had to fight for everything his life, and wasn't naturally skilled, but developed his skill over time. That wasn't actually talented, developed his skill over time and worked his way up to the platform. And you ask yourself the question, whose lives are more valuable? You can't make that determination. They're both valuable in their own way. They cannot be compared. And when Alex says, well, I could just hand you $20,000, I actually feel really bad for like crypto traders, like 18-year-olds who like start trading crypto and then they like make it big on accident, where like they trade all this cryptocurrency and then they like get millions of dollars. I actually feel bad for some of these young millionaires because they haven't lived enough life yet to be able to know exactly how to manage all that. Like they haven't matured to a point where they know what to do with that kind of money. It's the same thing we see with the lottery, where some people's mentalities and maturity just don't allow them to keep that money. And so it's going to be in terms of, is it still worthwhile? And so that's the way we have to think. And so I can say to Alex, like, sure, you can just give me the $20,000, but that doesn't negate that if I got the $20,000 a different way, that's all of a sudden no longer worthwhile. And what does that do? That gets us back in the seat of my argument, which is, well, is it going to be worthwhile to the creature, right?
Mhm.
In the end, will it be worthwhile to the creature? So it actually fits very well with what I'm saying. What was the part that you wanted me to address specifically? I just wanted to say that real fast.
Yeah. So how does the animal, so I was talking about
Right.
like your dog recognizes you're pleased with him. But how does this happen in the ultimate sense, in the afterlife with respect to his whole existence?
Yeah, absolutely. So I said in the video, hey, there's two theses on the table. It's funny. I saw a comment where someone said this dude was prepared to speak for hours, and I really was. The two views on the table are, there's one by a scholar named John Schneider and then Trent Doherty. John Schneider talks about how there will be an animal afterlife. They both believe in an animal afterlife, but Schneider believes that the animals will stay the same. They'll have the same constitution, but they'll be given this praiseworthy status in heaven where they will be recognized for the role they played in creation, where they weren't just background scenery or characters in a cast, right? God is actually morally interested in their lives, and they know that they are. And not only that, then in this afterlife scenario, not only are they being praised and almost given this martyrdom status where thank you for giving your life up in this particular story, but now that you are in heaven, God is now going to bestow upon them goods ad infinitum into the future, where God will be giving them blissful experiences for the rest of their life, where now the suffering has been defeated, but it's also been outweighed via compensation. That's one view. The other view is Trent Doherty actually argues.
Before you get to this other view, it should be mentioned that when those flags went up and you got pulled away, you were gonna talk about this second view, and you didn't get to talk about it. So this is great, because here you have an opportunity to talk about it more.
Exactly. And this is actually the view that I endorse, and I'll tell you why. The view that Trent Doherty puts forth is that at the resurrection, animals themselves will also be resurrected, like be given resurrected bodies. So he argues that the animals will retain their identities, but they will actually be resurrected to a higher form of consciousness akin to human-like consciousness, where they will actually now be given and bestowed the cognitive faculties that allow them to actually defeat their sufferings, retroactively consent and endorse and not regret the life that they lived. And then they can recognize what this was all for. So he actually believes that in the resurrection, it will also happen for the animals as well. One of the reasons why I endorse this view is because to be able to overcome suffering, especially trauma, like horrendous suffering, well, a precondition is that you need trauma releasing faculties. And our background knowledge tells us that, well, you need a certain higher order level of consciousness to be able to have the resources for trauma releasing faculties. You need to be able to have what are called meaning making capacities. The founder of the field of logotherapy, who was in Auschwitz, he was in the concentration camps, Viktor Frankl, he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote that book 9 days after surviving the concentration camps. His entire family died in that particular scenario. And he observed what allowed people to live and survive through the concentration camps and what led to people actually losing their lives in the concentration, losing hope, falling into despair. Where there's that famous example where they found written on the walls of the cells, God will have to ask me for forgiveness. Like that kind of despair. And Frankl said it was their capacity to form meaning in their suffering. And then we have the famous quote, there is a window between stimulus and response. And that is the attitude, the meaning that you have and assign to what you're going through. And he says this is the last of the freedoms that can be taken away from you, which is everything can be taken from you except your ability between stimulus and response to form meaning around the suffering that you are going through. And he said, and that is what allowed him to get through the concentration camps. Prior to that, he worked with suicide victims. And so what did he do in the concentration camps? He just said, well, now these are my patients now. I will deal with their suicidal tendencies. So it was the giving of himself in the concentration camps that got him through it. That's how he made meaning out of it. And so, but you need a higher form of consciousness to be able to do that. So I believe then that if animals are going to have this ability to defeat their sufferings in this subjective way, they need to have trauma releasing faculties. And I believe that it's going to have to be due to these meaning making capacities. And it's going to have to be a consciousness that they don't currently possess. So whatever that looks like for them, I believe that that's going to be the form that it takes because we know it's a requirement to defeat your suffering.
Wow. Man, those are two great answers to this. And, you know, I just as I'm listening to you, I was thinking, and maybe you said something to this effect, but if we believe that God is a God of justice, and that it would not be good if God did not engage justly with his creatures, then if some of these animals experience great suffering on earth, it seems like there should be some sort of justice, redemptive justice, we could say, that comes at some point. And if it didn't happen in this world, it seems like it would happen in the next world. And so that all makes a lot of sense to me, man. This is great. Is there anything else you want to say about this in kind of tying a bow in what we've discussed?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that we have to recognize is what I said in the beginning, which is you really have to ask yourself, do you believe that the most important thing about someone's identity is merely what they've gone through or what they've made of themselves, how they view themselves, how their perspective on their own life, what they've become from those experiences? Because if we just treat individuals as events, just slices of events, yeah, it looks stark. It looks terrible. It looks tragic up close. But if we view individuals and their identities in terms of where is this person going? What is their life on the whole? That's a very different view. And I think that ultimately there are two types of individuals on a theistic worldview. Those who have become victims to suffering and recover and defeat their sufferings, and then those who have yet to. I don't think that there's a third option. I think those are the only two types of individuals. And I think that if you recognize that a person is not just a mere amalgamation of events, but that person has an identity, and that how they view themselves and their life story is more important than just merely what's happened to them. I think you'll start to understand exactly why, where the worthwhileness in someone's mind can come from when it comes to suffering, and how it will never leave a lasting negative impact on someone's life. I think that what you can do is you can look back at moments in your own life where, if I just singled out that single moment, it looks tragic, but looking at where I'm at now, it's played a big role. And I think that an example I like to use is, if you were to tell like an alien race that is, and their only access to the human race is audio and images of pregnancy, and that is it, they're going to think that we are some terrible creatures, right? Because they don't have the context by which what pregnancy is about. And this is actually an example that Trent Doherty uses, where if I were to tell you, hey, a woman is screaming and crying in agony, you're going to be like, that's terrible. I go, she's having her first kid. You're going to go, this is amazing. Look at that shift in context right there. Mm-hmm. And the woman will gladly do it again. When we know this, women do that, right? Because they subjectively
and again and again and again and again.
Exactly. And the pain to them is completely outweighed and defeated by the relationship they form with their child. And so I think that when you put things in context, you can see how this defeat and worthwhileness plays out.
Tim, as we're kind of wrapping all this up, I'm thinking about this Sunday, I'm speaking in a church, and I'm speaking out of John chapter 16. And in John 16, Jesus says something very similar to what you just said. He's talking about how his disciples won't have him for a while. He's going to be gone from them, and it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have troubles. But he says, you'll see me again, you'll be with me. And he describes this whole experience of life as kind of like a woman who is in the stages of delivery, actually, and how this seems really difficult, really horrific in some respects. But then when she sees the child, she rejoices because a child has been brought into the world. And then he says that on that day, you'll have a joy that no one can take away from you. And I think that so perfectly adds a biblical and contextually accurate expression to what you're saying. Jesus says this too. This is like we're going through the birth pangs to glory, and one day we're going to be redeemed. All of this is going to be redeemed, and we'll have a joy that no one will be able to take us away. I'd love to have you back to talk about this more, because I've got all kinds of questions in my mind right now, Tim. Like, I'm thinking, okay, if one day, if I eat a cheeseburger, and one day that cow that is the reason I'm now eating this cheeseburger is given like a consciousness somewhat on par with mine, that's going to be kind of awkward, in heaven. so there's all, even if I revere the cow, still. So we'll have to have you back on talk about this stuff some more sometime. But man, thank you for going on the show. I hope that it really benefits your channel and your social media presence, because you're doing incredible work. And I'm just glad we had the chance to get to know each other. Thanks so much for coming on. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.